You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rancor. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to a Guerrilla History Dispatch. This is a little bit of a new series, let's say, or a new format for the show, but based on current events, we thought that it would be something that would be very useful for the audience. So for those of you who are unaware, Guerrilla History is the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Hakamaki, joined by one of my usual co-hosts, Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much. I hope you're well too, Henry.
Yeah, things are busy but good. But we have some very interesting events that have been unfolding over the last 24 hours, which is why we are putting together this dispatch, which is going to be a little short, condensed historical context, basically crash course on Guinea. Over the last 24 hours, we've seen a coup unfolding in Guinea. The longtime president, 11 years president of Guinea, has been deposed by the military, and it is very much a still unfolding situation. So we want to give the historical context of Guinea and of these characters that are in play here so that the listeners, as they see this story unfold, understand a little bit more what's going on. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to go through a couple of quick headlines so listeners who haven't seen the news at all, because Guinea is not very well covered in Western media whatsoever, have at least an idea of what the topic is going to be today. So from Reuters, we have elite Guinea army unit says it has toppled president. Special Forces soldiers appeared on Sunday to have ousted Guinea's long-serving president, telling the nation that they had dissolved its government and constitution and closed its land and air borders. From the Associated Press, we have soldiers detain Guinea's president, dissolve government. Mutinous soldiers in the West African nation of Guinea detained President Alpha Condé on Sunday after hours of heavy gunfire rang out near the presidential palace in the capital, then announced on state television that the government had been dissolved in an apparent coup d'etat. And from Al Jazeera, we have Guinea coup, military arrests president, dissolves government. Special forces say they dissolved the constitution and shut the country's land and air borders. And I actually have something of a personal connection to this story. One of my absolute best friends is in Guinea right now, doing some filovirus research, and is currently sheltering in place as the situation unfolds. So Emily, if and when you hear this, just know that I'm standing in solidarity with you and I'm hoping that you stay safe. But now we're going to turn to our guest, who basically what happened is I reached out to some of my Pan-African friends and said, who's someone that can give us this historical context on Guinea? And my good friend, Margaret Kimberly, from Black Agenda Report. And Margaret, if you're listening to this, and when you listen to this, I love you. You're just the best. Margaret Kimberly came back immediately and said, you have to bring on Abayomi Azikiwe, who is the editor of Pan-African Newswire, to talk about the situation. And so I reached out, and here we are just a few hours later. Hello, Abayomi. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. And I'm very happy, again, that Margaret put us in touch with you, because this is a situation that we really do need somebody who is well-versed in the subject to give us this historical context. So to get us into the conversation, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Abayomi, and say, why don't I allow you to give a little bit more of the context of this coup beyond just these headlines and a few of the blurbs that I read, and then get us into that historical context that's going to help us understand the situation. Can you talk about the colonial era a little bit, independence of Guinea, all of the coups of the post-independence period, because they actually hadn't had democratic elections until 2010. Can you just give us a little bit of that historical context, as well as filling in some of those gaps on the coup that's unfolding?
Once again, thanks for the invitation. And Margaret Kimberly. I have worked with her, shared panels with her at various conferences across the United States. I'm very glad that she had confidence in me to speak on this subject. Guinea is a very interesting country in West Africa. It was colonized by France. It was officially conquered, so to speak, by 1893. And the French incorporated it into their French colonial system throughout West and Central Africa. In 1893, there was resistance to French colonialism. One of the best known figures, of course, is Abayomi Azikiwe, who is a historical figure in regard to anti-colonial struggles. And also he was a guiding figure intellectually for the revolutionary movement that developed in Guinea during the post-World War II period. Secretary, President Ahmed Secretary, was the founding member of the post-colonial Guinean state. In 1958, the French had proposed a referendum where African countries would continue to be under French domination as part of a broader French community. Guinea, under the Democratic Party that was co-founded by Ahmed Secretary, voted no and rejected the French colonial plan for continued colonial and neo-colonial rule in Guinea. This set the country apart at that time from most of the other colonies that had been had fallen under French rule. Now we could look at Algeria in North Africa, which had been under French rule for approximately 130 years. And then in the post-World War II period, there was agitation on the part of the Algerian people for national independence. France responded with ruthless repression. Thousands of people were killed even prior to the beginning of the armed struggle that was launched by the National Liberation Front, the FLN, in 1954, and that lasted for 8 years. It's estimated that up to 1 million people could have been killed. Also in Cameroon, an organization called the Union of Peoples of Cameroon, the UPC, was also a revolutionary organization attempted to wage an armed struggle against French colonialism during the late 1950s and early 1960s. And two of the leaders, Ruben Nyombe, one of them, Ruben Nyombe, was assassinated by French intelligence forces. And there were other leaders who were also assassinated by the French. So when Guinea struck out on its own in 1958, France sought to undermine the whole post-independence process. They withdrew all their technicians, they withdrew all their equipment, and they also created a situation where it was very difficult for Guinea to gain credit on an international level. At that time, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah had just taken power in Ghana, which is a former British colony. And he was a close comrade with Ahmed Secretary, and they agreed to loan Guinea 10 million pounds, which was at the time probably about $25 million, which helped tremendously the tide over the country based upon its needs in the aftermath of the French colonial withdrawal. Then by 1960, many of the other countries did gain independence who had been under French colonialism, but many of them did not have the same political approach that Guinea took. Guinea was a Pan-Africanist country. Secretary had alliances with Modibo Keita, who was from Mali, which was also a former French colony, along with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And they set up a Ghana-Guinea Union initially in 1958. Then by 1960, they expanded it to the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union. These were like forerunners to the formation of the Organization of African Unity. So Guinea proclaimed itself to be on a socialist path of development. They supported the national liberation struggles. They were in alliance with China, with the Soviet Union, with Cuba, and other socialist countries and national liberation movements around the world. Well, of course, that gives you some basic background about the country, but it becomes very complicated after that point because the pressure that Guinea was under globally impacted the character of the governance inside the country. Guinea became a one-party state, the PDG, the Democratic Party of Guinea, and they developed their own ideological approach to socialism and Pan-Africanism. And Secretary Ray stayed in power from 1958 until April of 1984, when he suffered a heart attack while he was in Saudi Arabia in high-level economic and political discussions. He was then transported to the United States, and he died, according to official sources, on the operating room in Cleveland, Ohio. Right after his funeral, we had the first military coup that was led by two lower-ranking military officers. Lansana Conte was the dominant personality in that coup, and they essentially overturned everything that the PDG had done over the previous 27 years. So since that time period, Conte remained in power. He was ruthless in the way in which he administered the country. He died, and of course, there were subsequent coups. The election of 2010, in my opinion, was not the first democratic election in Guinea, because the whole democratic process started when they voted to reject French colonialism in 1958. So it depends on how you look at the whole question of democracy in Africa and also in terms of the international community. Just to briefly sum this up.
That's a very fair point, by the way. That is a very fair point. First democratically elected leader, I should have said.
Yes. Okay. Well, just to wrap this up, according to reports that have come out that you cited, Mamadi Doumbouya has apparently taken power as part of the special forces of the Guinean military. There are rumors that he was a part of the French legions, that he had some training or some connection with the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, which has troops deployed all over the African continent since 2008, when it was officially inaugurated. So yes, we're waiting to see how things develop. According to those reports, the Ministry of Defense indicated that the coup had not taken place, that it was being resisted. But that was kind of hard to believe since they had given a press conference with President Alpha Conde, showing him in detention, sitting on a sofa. So we don't know exactly what the future plans of this military junta is. They're calling themselves the National Committee for Reconciliation and Development. And they're claiming that they're against corruption. One thing that turned even more people against President Conde was his altering of the Guinean constitution during 2020 in order for him to serve a third term in office. And that's why a number of the opposition groups in Guinea are supporting the coup, which is going to complicate the situation vis-a-vis the role of the Economic Community of West African States, which is a regional organization, as well as the African Union, which is based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So others can add on to this, brief historical synopsis of Guinea from 1893 to 2021, but we can open up now for others to comment.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that brief but really cogent and important survey. I especially appreciate your remarks that there was a democratic process in rejecting the French colonial plans to create that community, and that as a result, Guinea, post-independence, paid a very heavy price as a result of French withdrawal and isolation in the international community. So that's very important, and also emphasizing how much they were part of a Pan-Africanist and anti-imperialist, anti-colonial politics, both in Africa but globally, is very important in situating those years between 58 and 84. So I think we do need to turn to this kind of post-Sékou Touré period and its complications, and particularly this last decade when we think of Alpha Conté's presidency. Perhaps you could expand a little bit. You mentioned that the successful attempt to change the constitution to enable a third term and to win the last round of contested elections. I know there are controversies around that. It's been disputed, made him unpopular. But that's just at the level of politics in terms of elections and who's in leadership. I'm wondering, over the last decade, what has happened to turn at least factions of the military and perhaps some elements of the populace? We don't know how popular, the coup is or will be, whether there are a lot of popular forces that will rally. You alluded to some of the opposition parties and powers aligning potentially with it. But what has happened in this last decade to sort of turn somebody who was known as a human rights figure, a dissident under, late Touré era against him?
Yes, I think that's important, that Alpha Condé was an opposition figure during the period of the Democratic Party of Guinea rule. Mm-hmm. Spent a lot of time in France and became well acquainted with the French political and economic system. Guinea is facing a similar problem that other African countries are facing across the continent. There's been, prior to the recent period, there was enormous economic growth from a quantitative standpoint in many different African states. However, qualitatively, you have to deal with the distribution of the economic wealth. You also have to deal with the sustainability of economic growth within these countries. Guinea, along with many other countries in Africa, are still dependent upon the Western capitalist system for the terms of trade and also the pricing of the commodities in which they export. Guinea is a large exporter of bauxite and aluminum aluminum prices have skyrocketed, interestingly enough, just in the last 24 hours since the coup. Yeah, it makes you wonder, what is behind all of this? So yes, anytime you have an unequal distribution of wealth, you have a political and economic system that is unsustainable. You have high unemployment among young people, and also a failure to harness agricultural production in a way in which not only can you keep people in rural areas involved in agricultural production, but also make it profitable for farmers and agricultural workers to survive. Then, of course, in the urban areas, there's the problems related to unemployment and other issues. So I think Guinea is no different than the other countries in the economic community of West African states. About 6 years ago, they were hit hard by the Ebola virus disease pandemic that struck principally three countries: Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea-Conakry. Thousands of people died. Many more were sickened during that whole period. This had a profound economic impact on the economic trajectory of the country. So the army, the special forces, are attempting to tap into that discontent related to corruption, the lack of genuine economic development and economic sustainability. So this is the problem that Guinea is facing and other countries in the West Africa region. Now, what's going to be interesting is to see how ECOWAS, even though they've condemned this coup, what can they actually do to reverse it? Because we saw a similar pattern in Mali last year, where the civilian elected government was overthrown. There was a lot of different opposition to this government and mass demonstrations and so forth. But they set up a interim government, but that too has been changed. So the principal figure in Mali right now is a military personality. So we'd be very interested to see what ECOWAS can do about this current situation, because over the last 2 decades, the African Union, which was founded in 2002, so almost 2 decades, has been bitterly opposed to military seizure of power. These incidents were quite common during the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 1980s. I mean, there were coups against Patrice Lumumba in 1960 in Congo, coup against Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. In 1968, Modibo Keita was overthrown in a military coup d'etat. And there have been many others. The president of Uganda, Milton Obote, was overthrown by Idi Amin in 1971. And we can go on and on about these military interventions in politics. So it's a very complicated situation, and we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens over the next few days. Internally, whether there's uniformity within the military ranks themselves, what opposition forces will continue to support the coup, and what will be the economic impact vis-a-vis ECOWAS and the African Union, as well as France, because Guinea still has close relations with France as well.
You've given me a lot of threads to chase here, Abayomi. I mean, too many threads. So I'm going to start punting things back, and perhaps we'll just kind of ping pong these ideas off of each other. But I guess the first thing I'll mention is Ebola, since I was an Ebola researcher. Absolutely, Guinea was one of the hardest hit countries ever. I mean, that was the biggest Ebola outbreak of all time. And Guinea was just about the hardest hit of the countries. And there was a lot of popular discontent at the handling of the epidemic of Ebola in Guinea. And it also did lead to massive economic issues, because it kind of was almost like a microcosm of what we're seeing right now with the pandemic, of them not wanting to shut down everything right away, then realizing that it was kind of spiraling out of control, then having to close down everything, the economy going into the tank, trying to reopen because the economy was in the tank, more people getting sick, having to close down the economy again. It sounds somewhat familiar to what we're seeing these days. But moving on to the resource point, you mentioned bauxite and aluminum. Depending on whose estimates you look at, Guinea is either the largest or the second largest resource of bauxite in the world. And interestingly, even before this coup happened, if you look at the commodity prices in London, aluminum prices were up 38% this year, even before the coup, based on consumer demand. But as soon as this coup happened, within the last 24 hours, and I should just mention that we're recording this on September 6th for people that are listening to this afterwards, within the last 24 hours, aluminum prices have already hit a 10-year high, and it appears that they're going to keep spiking as long as there's this turmoil. In regards to the coups, as you mentioned, there's a long history of coups, but even this year again, we've had 4 coups within this region, kind of West Central Africa, including 2 in Mali within the last year, this coup inside a coup, as you kind of alluded to. So I know that there wasn't really a firm question there, just a couple of follow-up points, but perhaps we just kind of want to kick those ideas around a little bit more in regards to economic issues. I mean, Alpha Conde, the president, now deposed president, massively increased the mining capacity for bauxite in the country. I say that they have the biggest or the second biggest resource of bauxite anywhere in the world. And for people that are unaware, bauxite is used in the production of aluminum. It's kind of like the precursor mineral for it. But Alpha Conde was really the one who massively expanded the capacity to extract that bauxite. But there's been a lot of criticism of, one, how that that wealth that comes from the extraction of the bauxite trickles down through the populace, as well as impacts on the rural population. As we see in a lot of these extractive economies, the rural populations in these mining areas often have extremely deleterious effects as a result of these extractive processes on them. So there's just a few ideas out there about, economic issues that were already bubbling up in the area, coups that have been going on in the area in no small part due to the imperialist powers, like France, for example, definitely had some fingerprints in Mali, not necessarily saying that they were pushing for the coup, but their interventions in the region certainly did assist in that coup becoming realized, as well as the resources that we are talking about here. Is there anything that you want to, chip in on that, either Adnan or Abayomi?
Well, just briefly, the area is extremely rich in regard to mineral resources. In Guinea, of course, we've been talking about bauxite and aluminum, but they also have strategic minerals as well, like gold and diamonds. And in neighboring countries, for example, Niger, France controls the production of uranium there. It was a company called Areva, which was based in France, which had almost total control of the uranium production. So we can see that France still plays a very dominant role in the overall economic life of the entire economic community of West African states. There was an attempt to form a single currency for the ECOWAS region a couple of years ago, but it was never able to really solidarize because of the legacies of British and French colonialism, perhaps being at odds against each other. Nigeria did not want to necessarily go along with it because they have their own economic interests based upon their own national currency. Nigeria, of course, is a large oil-producing state, which is undergoing a lot of internal turmoil as well. Chad, which is another country that experienced a coup, although it was a palace coup after the death of the leader who had been in power for many, many years. His son now has taken control of the country. And of course, there was objections to that on the part of the African Union, but that same system has not been removed so far. So these are some of the complexities that we have to look at in any attempt to analyze the history of Guinea and other countries throughout the region. Even under the first post-independence government of President Ahmed Sekou Touré, there were extreme difficulties in regard to economic development. And that is why a lot of young people left Guinea and went to neighboring countries such as Liberia and Ivory Coast, and of course fueled the whole opposition to the PDG. In comparison, during those times, if you compared the economic life in Guinea to Cote d'Ivoire, for example, people would say, well, Ivory Coast was a success story, and Guinea, with its socialist path or orientation, was a failure. So when you have these type of competing legacies in regard to the history of colonialism, and at the same time, different economic strategies for development, you're going to have these type of problems. But the West typically has the same approach that it has maintained since the 1950s and 1960s. They want to maintain full access to the mineral resources, to the agricultural commodities, and they want to get them on the terms that are favorable to the United States, to Britain, France, the European Union, and so forth. So this is the problem that Guinea is facing. And it's unfortunate that these military forces that have been built up inside of Guinea, inside of Mali, all have the impact of French and United States training, arming, political orientation as a part of their whole apparatus. You look at Mali, for example, every leader who has been involved in staging a coup since 2012, were trained in Pentagon military colleges inside the United States. They participated in joint military exercises with the United States, and France, whether it's Operation Flintlock, which the United States does on an annual basis, Operation Barkhane, which is a purported anti-terrorism task force that is assembled and headed by France. So all these factors are serving to destabilize and hamper the development of these countries in the West Africa region, with the emergence of the jihadist organizations, which are challenging the authority of the governments in Burkina Faso and in Mali. It really leaves an opening for these imperialist countries to come in under the guise of assisting in the national security apparatus of the country, and also to fight terrorism. So on the one hand, you have these jihadist organizations, many of which have been funded by allies of the United States, for example, Saudi Arabia. They have bases there, they have offices in Saudi Arabia. Yet, when they attack countries, whether they be in Africa, whether they be in Syria or Iraq, the US can easily utilize these realities to justify military interventions. We see it in Iraq, we see it in Syria, the support of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and we're looking at similar situations in West Africa, and is also spreading to the Southern Africa region in regard to what's happening now in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, where they're battling an insurgency there that's prompted the intervention of Rwandan defense forces, as well as the Southern African Development Community standby forces as well. So there's a lot to consider in this whole process.
Abayomi, I'm going to jump in real quick. I know Adnan and I have a lot of other things that we want to ask about, but since you brought up France and AFRICOM, AFRICOM is something that anytime it's brought up, I can't let the opportunity pass to, just continue to bash it a little bit more. So we're talking about this colonel that has conducted the coup, is at the head of this coup, Mamadi Doumbouya. He was a French Foreign Legionnaire for some years, having served in the military for 15 years. That's not all necessarily within the French Foreign Legion, having served missions in Afghanistan, Ivory Coast, Djibouti, Central African Republic. He's also apparently received training at the International Security Academy in Israel, as well as further military training in Senegal, Gabon, and France itself. This is somebody who's deeply entrenched within the imperial core proxy forces, let's say. And it's also notable that I've seen several reports coming out from, not our mainstream sources, but our alternative sources, that many of these individuals within this elite unit are individuals who have trained extensively or were essentially contractors with AFRICOM. So I would just like to highlight that fact a little bit more, the pernicious role of AFRICOM within West Africa, particularly the role of France within West Africa. And Adnan, I think that you also had something that you wanted to add on this, so maybe you want to add on to the question.
Well, no, we should let our guests talk about that, but I definitely would like to follow up a little bit more about the pivot to Africa, if there is, such a thing that seems to be coinciding with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obviously, they're not going to really completely withdraw. If they can find ways to use proxy forces and foment, kind of their policies within, but there's clearly they're looking at other global regions where some of the same pattern, and we know that it goes way back, to the 70s and 80s of Saudi Arabia funding extreme right-wing jihadist type forces in Africa as well. So that's like an old playbook that now they're extending even into West Africa. It's worth thinking more about it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue as well.
Well, in regard to AFRICOM, it's still based, as far as I know, in Stuttgart, Germany. It was formed in 2008, in February of 2008. And none of the African countries at that time were willing to allow their territories to be used as a base. That changed, of course, since 2008, over the last 13 years. Now we have a base in Djibouti, which is in the Horn of Africa, Camp Lemonnier, which has both French and AFRICOM troops, thousands of them stationed there. Also, China has set up a military base in Djibouti as well, which is quite interesting. In fact, when that happened a few years ago, the Voice of America, surprisingly enough, contacted me for a comment on that. One of the few times I've been contacted by the VOA. But yes, since that time, they've been doing the joint military exercises. They've been involved in training various African military structures. And they have been doing a lot of clandestine work, which is hidden from the American population. For example, in 2017, there were several Green Berets that were killed in the West African state of Niger. And there was never any credible explanation in regard to what happened in that incident. They never really explained what had happened. And of course, Trump, being president at the time, did not give a full explanation in regard to what happened. Also, in Somalia, the United States has been heavily involved in training the African Union mission to Somalia, AMISOM, which is there to fight against, well, initially they were there to fight against the Islamic Courts Union. And then there was a split in that grouping, and Al-Shabaab came out of that as a resistance movement against the AMISOM forces, which is largely composed of Ethiopia, Uganda, and other countries which have substantial militaries in Africa. In recent years, Al-Shabaab seems to be aligned with Al-Qaeda, one faction, and another faction with ISIS. So the war has still not stopped. And of course, just recently, the African Union has agreed to continue the AMISOM mission for another, I believe, 6 years. So when is this occupation going to end, despite the fact that the US has put a considerable amount of money into Somalia, propping up the AMISOM forces and doing other types of, quote, nation building, unquote, work in the Horn of Africa. So they're involved all over. Ethiopia right now is being destabilized. The northern region, the Tigray region, is involved in a conflict against the central government. We know that the TPLF was largely installed by the United States under George Bush Sr. in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet, well, actually after the collapse of the Workers' Party of Ethiopia government, which took place in 1991. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed just a few months later. So yeah, AFRICOM is very active on the African continent. Muhammadu Buhari, who's the president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, several months ago asked, could AFRICOM relocate their headquarters to Nigeria to deal with the instability that's taking place in the north and central part of the country, which was quite a shocking statement to be made by a country which supposedly has the largest economy on the African continent. They're saying the Nigerian economy now is larger than the economy in South Africa and Ethiopia and Egypt, and at the same time has one of the largest military forces on the African continent. Nigeria has oil, it has natural gas, and he's like throwing in the towel, saying, he can't handle the Boko Haram insurgency, which is also fractured at this point, as well as the general lawlessness that's prevailing in parts of northern and central Nigeria in regard to kidnapping of school children and other types of crimes. So it's a real major problem. And my opinion is that until the African Union can form its own African standby force that is independent of the US, independent of France, it's really not going to solve the crisis that exists on the African continent. It's no way they can be dependent upon countries which historically have been involved in colonialism, enslavement, and neocolonialism on the African continent, expecting these states to provide the security support that's needed to stabilize these countries, when in fact these countries are still dependent economically on the world economic system, which is still dominated by the US and countries in Western Europe.
Yeah, that's a really helpful survey of the way in which this Guinea this figure in Guinea fits within a wider network and pattern of neo-imperial involvement on the African continent.
So Adnan, are you a historian? Is that
I am, yes.
Okay. Well, of course, you know, of course, a lot of the things that I'm talking about in terms of the role of Europe and the United States and Africa, West Asia, in regard to, fostering this dependency, even during the post-independence period.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so it's a endemic pattern that's very hard to break. And so, we'll be looking, it'll be very interesting to see now, maybe coming back to Guinea, is thinking a little bit if perhaps you could describe what you see as the nature of current divisions and, in Guinea, so that we can understand, these opposition parties and their potential collaboration with this, military faction within the military there that's taken this coup. How would you describe, the nature of Guinea's politics if you were to do a kind of survey who's who and what's what, and whether these are principally ideological differences? I can imagine opposition during the Sékou Touré period may have taken the flavor of ideological differences because it was a very conscious ideological line of Pan-African socialism that they were developing. But, subsequently, I wonder if the waters have been muddied. How would you characterize the nature of kind of political identity and contestation in Guinea that would help us see, what are the alignment of forces on the ground within the country? Are these principally ethnic, ethno-linguistic? Are they just factions that have positioned themselves vis-a-vis, kind of corrupt a surplus from the neoliberal exploitation of their mineral resources, and whoever is facilitating that gets their sort of cut, and there's like factional disputes over controlling that? Maybe you can give us a little bit more of a sense of how you would analyze Guinea at present, so that'll help us understand who's going to be involved in determining the fate of the country internally as we go forward.
Well, I think all those factors that you mentioned play a major role in all of this. The PDG, their legacy, doesn't appear to be a major factor in Guinean politics today. Of course, there are people there who still identify as members of the Democratic Party of Guinea, but they have not been able to mobilize and organize to the point of even contesting electorally to retake power in Guinea. Many of the other parties that exist there are parties that are pro-Western, are pro-French, pro-American. And of course, the factionalism is largely based upon staking out territory within the state in order to benefit from the economic agreements with the international community. This is an unfortunate situation, but that appears to be the reality. Now, the military itself is part, of the governing structure, and there's this tension between the political elites, so to speak, and the military forces inside the country. Even within the military itself, there are divisions. Lower-ranking military officers have a tendency to be not satisfied with events involving the higher-ranking elements of the military, the elite forces within the military. So we've seen historically in Guinea, as well as in other countries in West Africa, where you have coups among lower military ranking officers against higher military ranking officers who are in alliance with political elites. So we'll have to study the response to the seizure of power by the National Committee for Reconciliation and Development, which political parties support them, which political parties are in opposition to them. And at that point, we'll be able to get a clearer view in regard to how the politics of the country is going to move forward. But I don't see in the short term an effort on the part of the population to actually seize power in its own interests. There are too many divisions within the country, and with the French and US involvement within the military, this is going to hamper and stifle any genuine political movement from emerging in Guinea. If we look, for example, at Burkina Faso, there was a huge uprising there about 7 years ago, where the gentleman who had Campagneur, who had overthrown and assassinated Thomas Sankara, was overthrown and ran out of the country to Ivory Coast. And many of the parties that claimed to be Sankara's revolutionaries and following in the tradition of Thomas Sankara were still not able to unite to take power in Burkina Faso. The person who became leader had strong ties to international finance capital. So it's going to take a lot for these developments to reach fruition. In Togo, for example, another French colony, there was a huge uprising about 3 years ago there. And popular organizations emerged. They were against the political dynasty that's been in control in Togo for approximately 50 years, Iyadama dynasty. And yet, these same elites are able to maintain power because they control the economies, they control the military apparatus, the security apparatus. So it's going to be very difficult to have a real progressive national democratic movement come to power in these countries.
Final question that we have time for, and this is one from our co-host Breht O'Shea of Revolutionary Left Radio, who wanted to join us for the conversation, but unfortunately this being a very, very last minute episode, because as we've mentioned multiple times, this is a situation that's still unfolding. We basically put this together as quickly as we could. This question comes in from Breht. Absolutely. It's been a great conversation, but this last question comes in from Breht, and it's a great question. He's wondering how the major powers are going to be viewing this coup, as far as we can tell, because not a whole lot is known about this colonel who has basically seized power in this coup. We don't even know how the coup is going to unfold from here. It's still a developing situation. But of course, major powers right now are all going to be denouncing the coup. They're going to be denouncing any sort of military intervention to disrupt some sort of democratic processes, such as they are anywhere. And we've already seen this. We've seen statements from the United States. We've seen statements from Russia. We've seen statements from all over the place, the United Nations, the European Union condemning any sort of coup. But just, maybe let's speculate a little bit here, Abayomi. How do you think that these major powers are going to be viewing this coup? Maybe the United States, Russia, China. How are they going to be looking at the ouster of Alpha Conde and the incoming military junta?
Well, the problem is that they may denounce the military intervention in politics and the detention of the ousted President Conde, but at the same time, their principal interest is their economics stakes, in Guinea, and that goes for the United States as well as France. And that is the bottom line as far as they're concerned. On the surface, of course, they're going to say they support civilian rule, but in actuality, they're going to want to continue to extract bauxite out of Guinea and whatever other resources they have that benefit the world economic system. So I don't think that what these countries say on the surface is necessarily what they're doing behind the scene. We see this in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where in the eastern region, you have rebel organizations that are guarding mines for multinational corporations that are making billions of dollars every year from these mineral resources, which are not benefiting the people in Congo at all. We have the same situation in Guinea and other countries throughout the ECOWAS region.
Well, that just one quick follow-up on
Go
that is, I'm wondering, given this circumstance, clearly Alpha Conde was useful,
Yes.
you know, as a figure. I mean, he was closely tied with the sort of neoliberal establishment. He was a human rights professor in France, and so when he won these elections, we've seen that under his decade, there's been a ramping up of the mineral exploitation, you know, to the benefit of Western companies. I imagine there were many Canadian companies. You know, Canadian mining companies are among the biggest in the world and working all across South America and Africa. So there would be one reason definitely to condemn this military coup, quite apart from adherence to democratic norms and so on, is that it introduces some potential instability and clarity about what the direction of the policy will be. And I wonder in this context, given China's sort of importance, increasing importance in Africa, you alluded to even them establishing a military base in Djibouti, if there's some possibility that you can get less hassle as a colonel who's done a military coup by working with China, that isn't going to make a huge deal about your democratic norms. And this is what I've heard from people who work in development institutions in Africa, is that on the ground people say we're fed up working with the EU and the US because they just will lecture you about corruption and, you have to reform your legal codes and so on. Whereas when you work with the Chinese, it's very clear, you negotiate with them and they need to build a road, they're going to build a road, and they're not going to come in and try and redo your entire political system to make it more amenable for exploitation by Western imperial powers using those norms of the international community. So I'm wondering if this is an opportunity in some ways where Guinea may, look to China or other powers to provide some of the technical services and resource extraction, and whether they can cut a different kind of deal. And that's what, might be very concerning to the West in this situation.
It is concerning to the West. And China has grown in regard to its influence on the African continent over the last 20 years with the formation of the Forum on China-Africa Relations, FOCAC, cooperation, and a lot of global trade between China and Africa. And of course, the African countries have been invited to be a part of the Silk Road Initiative on the part of Beijing. So yes, I think this is a possibility that they could develop closer relations with China, but still that will not solve completely the internal contradictions within Guinea itself, the need for a stable political system, a genuinely democratic system, equal distribution of wealth inside the country. That is the principal issue that people in Guinea and all over the African continent are facing today. And I think that the U.S. is very concerned about the role of China with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It appears as if they want to regroup to place more forces against China's growing influence in Asia and in other parts of the world. And they can't do that if they're tied up in other geopolitical regions, for example, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others. So the next few months and the next couple of years, particularly under the Biden administration, is going to be very important in regard to the orientation of the United States. It's quite interesting that Biden has kept in place the tariffs and other restrictive measures in regard to China. I don't think they've been lifted at all. The same thing with Cuba. In fact, they've enhanced sanctions against Cuba. So it shows that they still have the same strategic objective. They just have a different tactical approach by rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Makes the United States look good on the surface. But when you go beneath the surface to actually see that they are quite concerned about their influence internationally. And this humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan is really going to damage the global prestige of the United States. China, Russia, as well as Iran have all said that they're willing to work with the Taliban government, or the government the Taliban is trying to put together in Afghanistan, whereas the European Union has said categorically they're not going to recognize, and the British are saying they're not going to recognize the new government in Afghanistan when it is formed. And the United States has not been clear on that question either. So we'll have to see how things unfold. It's a very interesting period that we live in right now.
For sure, for sure. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And that we're going to close right here, because anything that we go, the longer that we go, the more is going to have happened while we were recording. And so the more out of date
Exactly.
we'll be. So I want to make sure that I get this up on our feed as quickly as possible. Again, listeners, I hope that this Guerrilla History dispatch serves as a useful resource for you to understand the unfolding events in Guinea. Again, our guest was Abayomi Azikiwe, editor of Pan-African Newswire. Abayomi, it was absolutely wonderful having you on the show. I'm hoping that we can bring you back in the future to talk about, hopefully not the same topic, but almost anything else. It was really a great conversation with you. Can you tell the listeners how to find you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I'm on Facebook under my name. I'm on Instagram, also Twitter. And I have a blog, the Pan-African Newswire. It's at panafricannews.blogspot.com. And my writings are published by News Ghana, for example, Global Research, local website called fightingwords.net, and others. So all you got to do is Google my name and you'll find a lot of the work that I'm doing. Great.
And listeners, I'll have some of that linked in the description below. So if you want to find Abayomi's work, as well as his profiles, just scroll down in the description box and you'll find those links down there to listen to, or to find more of his work.
So we really appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And it was really a treat meeting both of you.
Absolutely. And again, thanks to my friend Margaret Kimberly for putting us in touch with you. It was as soon as she said it, I knew it was going to be great. So I can't say I'm surprised, but at the same time, it was a really excellent interview. And so listeners, again, I hope that this was useful for you. Feel free to send it around. In fact, please do send it around to anyone who wants to understand the context of what's going on. Adnan, instead of us having our usual sign-offs on how to find us individually, I'll just say how to find the show. Listeners, you can find us on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. And you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/Guerrilla History. Again, Guerrilla being spelled GUERRILLA. Until next time, listeners, solidarity.